I thought I had won the lottery of love. Sophia was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Confident, magnetic, and fiercely independent. The kind of woman who lit up a room with a smile and left everyone else feeling like a supporting character in her story. From the very beginning, she made me feel like the luckiest man alive. But perfection, I would learn, always comes at a cost. When we met, she dazzled me with her charm and sophistication. She seemed to glide effortlessly through life, always dressed impeccably in tailored blazers and high heels, as though she just stepped out of a fashion magazine. She had an air about her that made me believe she had it all together: career, ambition, class. I never thought to question where it all came from or how she managed it. There were signs, though. Small, inconsequential things I brushed aside, like the way she avoided talking about her finances. She'd laugh and change the subject whenever I asked how she afforded her luxurious lifestyle. "I work hard," she'd say, and I let that be enough. Why wouldn't I? She radiated competence, and I wanted to believe her. Looking back now, I feel like an idiot. Those moments were the cracks in the facade, tiny fissures that I ignored because I didn't want to spoil the fantasy. The first real flag should have been the extravagant vacation she surprised me with 6 months into our relationship. An all-inclusive trip to an island resort. It wasn't just the destination, it was the private cabanas, the fine dining, the first-class tickets she insisted on upgrading at the last minute. I remember staring at the bill as it popped up on her phone when she handed it to the waiter to settle the check for a lavish dinner. My chest tightened. I couldn't imagine spending that kind of money on a single meal. "You deserve it," she told me when she saw my hesitation. "We deserve it." And like a fool, I let her smile smooth over my concerns. I told myself I was overthinking things. Maybe I was just too cautious, too practical. Maybe I wasn't the kind of person who knew how to enjoy life the way she did. And that became the pattern. I would notice things, tiny inconsistencies, unexplained luxuries, or her occasional defensiveness about money, and I'd convince myself it wasn't my place to question them. Sophia's allure blinded me to everything else. It was easy to focus on her laugh, the way she could command a room, or how she made me feel like the center of her universe. I didn't want to ruin that. But some things you can't ignore forever. I didn't know it at the time, but her perfect life wasn't as effortless as it seemed. Beneath the glamorous exterior was a carefully constructed illusion. And while I was blissfully imagining a future with her, she was laying the groundwork for my financial and emotional ruin. When I think back to those early days, I realize how naive I was. I thought I'd found a partner to build a life with, someone who would walk beside me through whatever challenges we faced. But instead, I'd invited a storm into my home, a storm disguised as the woman of my dreams. It was only the beginning. It started small, so small that I didn't even realize the walls of my life were beginning to shift. A little extra spending here, an unusual charge there. I told myself these were harmless oversights, nothing that couldn't be explained. But when you're walking on a foundation of lies, the cracks are always deeper than they seem. I first noticed it in our bank statements, months after we'd decided to merge our finances. The numbers didn't add up. Sophia had always insisted on managing the bills, saying she was better at that sort of thing. But I had access too. That's when I saw it. Small withdrawals, $50 here, $100 there, from accounts I thought we'd agreed not to touch. I asked her about it casually one evening. Her smile was as breezy as ever, her explanation a little too smooth. "Oh, that must be a mix-up," she said, brushing me off with a wave of her hand. "I'll look into it." I let it go, but once you start seeing cracks, it's impossible to unsee them. There were other things, little moments that left me uneasy. Her phone was always buzzing, yet she rarely shared what those messages were about. "Work stuff," she'd mutter, or sometimes just silence the phone altogether. Her spending became more frequent too, though she always found a way to justify it. I needed a new dress for the gala. The sale was too good to pass up. We deserve nice things. Still, I didn't push. What kind of husband second-guesses his wife over a shopping spree? The turning point came when I found her desk drawer. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a pen. Instead, I found envelopes, dozens of them, marked with words like "final notice" and "urgent payment required." I froze, my hand hovering over the pile, my heart pounding. What the hell was this? I sat down on the edge of the bed, holding one of the envelopes like it might explode. It was addressed to her, a credit card statement showing a balance I didn't even know existed. Thousands of dollars spent at department stores, online retailers, and of course, the luxury boutiques she loved to frequent. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. My mind raced with questions I wasn't ready to ask. Why hadn't she told me? What else was she hiding? I confronted her later that night. She was calm, too calm, as if my concerns were an overreaction to something trivial. "It's just a mix-up," she said again, her voice dripping with irritation. "Why are you even going through my things?" I backed down. What was I supposed to say? I didn't want to accuse her of anything without proof, and maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Then there was the night her phone buzzed while she was in the shower. I glanced at the screen instinctively, and there it was. A text from an unknown number about a missed payment. My stomach turned, but I said nothing. The more I looked, the more I found. It wasn't just one credit card, it was several. The balances were enormous, the interest compounding into sums that would take years to pay off. Still, I hesitated. Was I being paranoid? Overly controlling? Every time I considered confronting her, I pictured that radiant smile, the way she made me feel like the best version of myself. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to lose her. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a small mistake. This was a pattern, a shadow creeping through the life we were building together. I had no idea how deep it ran or how much worse it could get. I wasn't just starting to see cracks in the facade. The entire structure was beginning to crumble. When the envelope arrived, I knew it wasn't another mistake. The bright red final demand stamped across the front wasn't subtle. My hand shook as I opened it, the words on the page slicing through me like glass. A $50,000 loan. Defaulted. Overdue. And Sophia's name scrawled neatly at the top. I stared at the page, my mind refusing to believe what my eyes were showing me. This wasn't a shopping spree or a few maxed-out credit cards. This was something far more sinister, something that could destroy us. The confrontation wasn't planned. It erupted, raw and ugly, as soon as she walked through the door that evening. I held the letter in my hand like a weapon, trembling with anger and disbelief. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling, trying to mask the desperation underneath. At first, she tried to brush it off, just like she always did. "It's nothing," she said, her tone calm, almost patronizing. "I'll handle it." But I pressed harder, holding up the evidence she couldn't deny. That's when her facade cracked. Her calm dissolved into panic, then into tears. She confessed in fragments, each piece worse than the last. The loan, she explained, had been to cover debts she'd been hiding for years. Gambling debts. My head spun as the words tumbled out of her. She admitted to secret accounts, late-night online poker games, and high-stakes bets I never knew existed. And it didn't stop there. The debt wasn't just gambling. Thousands of dollars had gone to designer clothes, handbags, and luxury items. She claimed it was all for us, to keep up appearances, to look the part of a successful couple. "I wanted to make you proud," she said, tears streaming down her face. But there was no pride in this, only betrayal. I tried to hold on to my anger, to push past her excuses, but her tears cut through me like knives. For a moment I felt guilty, as though I'd somehow driven her to this. Had I been too demanding, too focused on saving? Was I the reason she felt the need to hide so much? Her sobs turned into self-pity as she spun her story further. She wasn't just confessing, she was deflecting. It was the stress, she claimed. The pressure of trying to live up to impossible standards. She told me she'd felt trapped, desperate to keep our life together from falling apart. It was a masterclass in manipulation. The anger inside me simmered, bubbling beneath the surface. I couldn't understand how she'd let it get this far. A $50,000 loan was one thing, but the web of lies stretched far beyond that single envelope. I thought of the unopened bills, the late-night texts, the unexplained charges. I thought of every time she'd smiled and told me everything was fine. And now I was supposed to believe that this wasn't her fault? She begged me to forgive her, to give her another chance. "I'll fix this," she promised. "I'll change." But I didn't know if I could believe her. The weight of the truth pressed down on me, threatening to crush the love I'd built my life around. How had I been so blind? How had I let this happen? She cried harder, clutching at me like I was her lifeline, but I felt myself pulling away. Her tears didn't feel like regret. They felt like fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing me. I couldn't shake the image of the loan statement in my hand, the cold numbers staring back at me. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust. Trust that she'd shattered and might never be able to rebuild. That night, as she cried herself to sleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The cracks in our life weren't cracks anymore. They were gaping holes, threatening to swallow me whole. I didn't know it then, but this was only the beginning. When people tell you the person you love would never hurt you, they don't account for desperation. I thought the worst of Sophia's betrayal had been laid bare with her gambling and debt, but I didn't realize that exposure would only push her deeper into manipulation. Her promises to change started immediately. Counseling, budgeting, full transparency. Words that felt hollow even as she said them. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it. I wanted to believe it. But trust doesn't come back that easily, especially when her actions told a different story. I found receipts for luxury goods she claimed to have returned. A new credit card statement showed charges for online games she swore she'd quit. It wasn't a mistake or a relapse. It was intentional. Sophia wasn't changing. She was doubling down. When I confronted her again, the narrative shifted. This wasn't her fault, she said. This was about me. I was controlling, judgmental, unsupportive. I didn't understand how much pressure she was under. Her tears flowed freely as she painted herself as the victim of a man who didn't appreciate her sacrifices. It was a story she started telling not just to me, but to anyone who would listen. At first, I didn't realize what she was doing. Then the calls started. Friends and family who'd always had kind words for me suddenly sounded cold. "Are you okay?" They'd ask her in front of me, their eyes filled with concern. Sophia would lower her head, playing the part of a woman too afraid to speak. "It's complicated," she'd say. The gossip spread like wildfire. I heard whispers at work, felt the sideways glances at gatherings. Even close friends began to distance themselves. People started believing I was the villain, an abuser, a tyrant. I can still hear the venom in the voice of an old college friend who called me out of the blue. "You don't let her have her own life," she said. "You're suffocating her. No wonder she feels trapped." I was stunned. My entire world was turning against me piece by piece. No one wanted to hear my side. Sophia was too convincing, her act too perfect. She cried on cue, smiled at the right moments, and played the part of the wounded wife to perfection. The weight of it all began to crush me. I questioned everything, my choices, my actions, even my own memories. Had I been too controlling? Had I failed her somehow? I wanted to believe I was a good husband, but her web of lies made me doubt even that. And yet, I knew the truth. I had the proof, the bills, the loans, the receipts for every lie she'd told. But what good was evidence when everyone had already picked their side? The worst part wasn't the accusations. It wasn't the way my friends looked at me or the way her family stopped returning my calls. It was the loneliness. The absolute bone-deep isolation of knowing the person you trusted most had turned your life into a battleground. There were nights I sat alone in the dark, staring at the stack of bills and wondering if it was worth fighting anymore. She had the world convinced I was a monster. Even I wasn't sure I wasn't one. But I kept going. Not because I felt strong, I didn't. I was hanging on by a thread. I kept going because there was no other choice. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the doubt and the despair, I knew the truth would come out. And when it did, I would have my life back, no matter how many people she turned against me in the process. There's a breaking point for everyone. For me, it came when I opened our joint investment account and saw the balance. 0. Not low, not dwindling. 0. Every dollar gone. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening as the realization sank in. Sophia had drained it. The money we'd saved for our future, our home, our security, was gone. A tightness gripped my throat and my hands clenched the desk so hard my knuckles went white. This wasn't just betrayal. This was robbery. When I confronted her, she didn't even bother with tears this time. She was defiant, standing in the middle of the room with her arms crossed, like I was the one at fault. She told me she'd needed the money to pay off some urgent debts, and accused me of being selfish, for caring more about a bank account than her well-being. Then she said it. "If you were a real man, you'd support me instead of blaming me." The words hit like a slap. My anger flared, but underneath it was something worse. Shame. I couldn't explain it, but her words wormed into my mind, twisting my sense of right and wrong. Was I failing her? Was I the problem? No, not this time. I felt something harden inside me. A line had been crossed, and there was no going back. I couldn't save this marriage, not without losing every shred of myself in the process. That night, I started making calls. A lawyer, a financial advisor, anyone who could help me begin untangling myself from the wreckage Sophia had created. I spent hours gathering documents, statements, receipts, proof of every lie and every dollar she'd stolen. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was preparing for battle. It wasn't easy. Every step felt like a betrayal of the vows I'd once cherished, but I knew there was no saving us. The woman I loved didn't exist anymore, if she ever had. Filing for divorce was the hardest thing I've ever done. It felt like admitting failure, like I'd given up on something sacred, but I couldn't keep sacrificing myself to save someone who didn't want to be saved. When Sophia found out, she was furious. She accused me of trying to ruin her, of abandoning her when she needed me most. Her words were daggers meant to cut deep, and for a moment they did. But the anger behind them only reinforced what I already knew. This wasn't about love. This was about control. Even as the paperwork moved forward, she kept playing her games. She told our mutual friends I was punishing her for her mistakes, that I was cruel and vindictive. The narrative she'd built as the victim became her weapon, and she wielded it with precision. I didn't respond, I couldn't. The truth was my only weapon, and I had to trust that it would be enough. But trust doesn't make it easier to walk into an empty house every night, to watch the life you built crumble around you. There were nights I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the right choice. The doubts never fully left me. They clung to the edges of my mind like shadows, whispering that I was the bad guy, that I'd failed her, that maybe I deserved this. But no matter how heavy the weight of those thoughts became, I kept moving. I protected what was left of my finances. I documented every conversation, every threat, every lie, and I held on to one unshakable truth. I wasn't the villain in this story. The storm wasn't over. I could feel it brewing, dark and vicious on the horizon. But for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Hope. The courtroom was cold, the kind of place where words were weapons, and every sentence felt like a battle. I sat there, surrounded by people who once considered us the perfect couple, while Sophia spun her final web of lies. She cried, of course. She painted herself as the dutiful wife who had fallen victim to impossible expectations and an overbearing husband. But the evidence spoke louder than her tears. The documents I'd gathered told a story she couldn't refute. The gambling debts, the forged loan applications, the drained accounts. It was all there, black and white. For months, she'd siphoned money from our life together, using my trust as her personal piggy bank. When the judge asked her to explain, her excuses sounded hollow even to the people who'd been defending her. She stammered, reaching for sympathy, but there was nothing left to cling to. I didn't feel triumphant when the ruling came down. Relief, maybe. Exhaustion. The court held her accountable for the debt she'd accrued in my name, and the divorce was finalized with clear financial boundaries. But no legal decision could erase what she'd done or the scars she'd left behind. The fallout didn't end in the courtroom. Sophia's lies had started unraveling in her personal life, too. The friends who had rallied to her side, ready to shield her from my so-called abuse, began to see her for who she really was. I heard about it from one of those friends, someone who had once confronted me in anger. She called to apologize, her voice hesitant but sincere. "I'm so sorry," she said. "We didn't know. She made it sound like you were the problem." Her story was one of many. Sophia had burned every bridge in her desperation to keep the facade alive. She'd borrowed money from friends, lied about her circumstances, and left a trail of betrayal in every corner of her life. Then came the final blow. One evening, I got a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. They'd been at a luxury boutique, one of Sophia's favorite haunts, when she caused a scene. She'd tried to make a purchase, but her credit card had been flagged for default. When the staff refused to let her leave with the items, she erupted, accusing them of harassment and discrimination. The friend who told me about it didn't hide their satisfaction. They escorted her out in front of everyone, they said. She was shouting the whole way. It was pathetic. Hearing that, I felt no joy, no schadenfreude, just a strange, quiet vindication. Sophia had spent so long convincing the world and herself that she was untouchable. Now, even the places she'd once ruled were shutting her out. In the days and weeks that followed, the apologies came in waves. Friends who had turned their backs on me reached out, each one confessing their regret. "I believed her lies," one said. "I'm ashamed I didn't see it sooner." But not all the damage could be undone. Trust, once shattered, doesn't come back easily. The relationship Sophia had poisoned would never feel the same. And as for her, the life she'd built on illusion was gone. No more designer clothes, no more high-end dinners, no more carefully curated image of perfection. She was left with nothing but the wreckage of her own making. I won't lie and say it felt like a victory. There's no real victory in surviving something like this. But there was peace in knowing the truth was out there, that the people who mattered finally saw me for who I was, not the monster she'd made me out to be. And as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I realized something else. She hadn't just lost me. She'd lost everything. Freedom didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like the first rays of sunlight after a long, brutal storm. For months, I had felt like I was clawing my way out of a pit, dragging the weight of Sophia's lies and my own shattered trust behind me. But now, with the divorce finalized and the truth laid bare, the weight began to lift. The first morning in my new apartment, I woke up to silence. No buzzing phone, no staged tears, no whispered accusations. It was just me, a cup of coffee, and the faint sounds of the city waking up outside my window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Some scars take longer to heal than others. The doubt she'd planted in me lingered, creeping in during quiet moments. Was I truly a good man? Had I failed her somehow? Those questions haunted me at first, but with time and therapy, I started to see them for what they were. Her lies, not my truths. I threw myself into rebuilding, one piece at a time. Work became my sanctuary, a place where I could prove, to myself more than anyone else, that I was capable, competent, and deserving of success. I reconnected with friends I'd lost during Sophia's smear campaign, and though some relationships were beyond saving, others welcomed me back with open arms. Even my hobbies started to feel like mine again. I picked up running, something Sophia had always dismissed as pointless. Each mile felt like I was reclaiming a part of myself she had tried to overshadow. The biggest change, though, was financial. Sophia's debt had taught me lessons I never wanted to learn but couldn't afford to ignore. I worked with financial advisors to rebuild my savings, cutting out the noise and focusing on what mattered. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not just of my money but of my future. The apologies from people who had believed Sophia's lies continued to trickle in. One day, a former mutual friend reached out. She'd been one of Sophia's staunchest defenders during our divorce. Now she admitted she'd been wrong. "She told us what we wanted to hear," she said. But seeing her fall apart like that, it was clear who the problem really was. It was that friend who told me about the boutique incident, how Sophia had been escorted out, shouting about harassment. The details didn't shock me anymore. Sophia's need for control and attention had always been her downfall. Hearing it didn't bring joy, but it did bring closure. Knowing that others now saw the truth, without me having to prove it, felt like vindication in its purest form. Sophia's karma played out quietly but completely. Her creditors pursued her relentlessly. Her social circle dwindled to nothing. Even her family, the last holdouts of her support system, began to distance themselves when her requests for help turned into demands. But none of that was my concern anymore. For the first time in years, my life was mine again. It's funny. When you're in the middle of a storm, it feels endless. You can't imagine a way out. But here I was, standing on the other side, stronger than I'd ever been. Looking back, I didn't feel anger or regret. I felt gratitude, not for Sophia, but for the lessons her betrayal had taught me. She'd tried to break me, but instead, she'd shown me what I was capable of enduring. My life now isn't extravagant. It's not filled with designer clothes or luxury vacations. It's quiet, simple, and honest. And that, I've realized, is exactly what I want. Because the best revenge isn't watching someone else fall apart. It's thriving in the life they thought they could ruin. And I was thriving.